Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Celonis custom webinar with Merck. My name is Christoph Grossbeyer, and I will be your host for today. The topic is process transformation at Merck, Celonis accelerating RPA. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Steve Carpenter with me, who is the Executive Director of Global Business Services Technology at Merck, and he will share his vision and experience in driving process transformation at Merck. Today, we will get started with a brief introduction by me before I hand it over to Steve to share his story about the process transformation at Merck. At the end, we have room for a Q&A. But before we get started, just some minor housekeeping. The session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the call. There will be a Q&A at the end, so feel free to submit your question via the GoToWebinar panel at any point of the presentation, and we'll try to answer it at the end for the Q&A. And all attendees will be muted throughout the session, so if you do have questions, please reach out via the GoToWebinar panel box. All right, so let's get started. The title of today's webinar is Process Transformation. So the recurring theme of today's business conversation. We've been talking about how businesses need to make change, how they need to transform. But where does the transformation imperative really come from? Look at this number here. Only 12% of 1955 Fortune 500 companies remain so today. Only 12% survived and remained Fortune 500 companies. And why is that? Because competition is created, competition will adapt and move on, and you don't want to be left behind. So the transformation imperative is clear, but for a lot of companies, change and transformation is actually hard. And why is that? Because they've organized themselves into vertical structures in their history, blocking cross-departmental communication and collaboration, thinking about marketing, thinking about supply chain, thinking about procurement. And based on these siloed organizations, a lot of the optimization is actually done in these siloed ways. Marketing has their own metrics, supply chain has their own metrics. But metrics should not manage behavior, and often the easiest thing to measure may not be the right things to measure. It really needs to have that end-to-end understanding across the departmentals, unsiloed, in order to drive transformation. And this is where the Celonis vision comes in. Imagine your business being transformed. Because the companies that we're working together are companies that embrace collaboration across silos, focus on delivering value to all stakeholders. Instead of metrics and a intra-departmental optimization, they're looking at making progressive recommendations across the entire process and value chain to execute more intelligent. And the technology behind this is the Celonis Intelligent Business Cloud. This offering really builds on the transformation journey that we support. We gather data from all of your systems, is it ERP system, CRM, or any IT system that you're using. Then we're using the process mining technology to create event logs and reconstruct the process visual to begin that discovery of where do we actually have to start transforming. And as you move through the analysis and see where your improvement opportunities lie, you're actually able to take advantage of our action engine and intelligent business application to enhance, expand, and personalize the transformation of your company's processes and operations. And this transformation capability is really the core of Celonis. Because if you're using our Intelligent Business Cloud, you really understand where you need to transform. And that transformation can come from a whole different sector. Is it human change, where you actually understand how can I improve the way employees execute the process around augmented work or training? Is it technology shift, where we're actually changing the underlying technologies and systems, if we're supporting an S4 migration, a system transformation, or a consolidation as part of a post-merger? And for today, the process transformation, where we actually change the way the process is executed. Is it done by harmonization of processes? Is it done by automation of processes, and so on? And here's really the challenge when we're looking at process transformation automation, that when we apply automation, to an efficient system, it actually magnifies the efficiency. So when we have a well-run system, we apply automation to it, then we can actually get much more benefit out of automation. But when we apply automation now to an inefficient operation where processes are broken and operations are not running smoothly, we actually magnify the inefficiency. So applying automation without taking a step back and understanding how efficient are actually our operations today is really the core. And this is really the automation journey that we undertake together with our customers, using the Celonis technology to analyze your assets processes, improve your existing processes, then understand the automation potential and set adequate goals of what you're trying to achieve. And then you select and implement the automation solution and monitor them as you scale your automation initiative. And it's my great pleasure today, out of the many customers that we're working with, that Merck and Steve is here today to share his story, his transformation journey at Merck, and the experience that he made. Merck is a great example on how far you can actually drive the transformation power of Celonis. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve to you. Steve is responsible for driving the right enablers for the shared service organization at Merck to ensure that the organization is taking advantage of automation, analytics, and technology in order to drive efficiency and productivity, as well as standardization across all of our locations. So with no further ado, Steve, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you, Christoph. Appreciate the introduction. Let me talk to you a little bit about Merck to begin with, just so you get a context of who we are and what we've been doing. We've been around for about a century. Our headquarters are located in New Jersey. And we have probably almost 70,000 employees. And in 2017, we had about $40 billion worth of revenue. If you move to the next slide, our core areas of focus are really around diabetes, oncology. You may have heard of Keytruda, which is one of our major products in the oncology space. We work on vaccines. We have hospital acute care, and then we have an animal health division as well, where we're focused on the various species that you see on the right-hand side. In our world, we wanted to kind of aspire to become something greater than what we were. So if you move to the next, there we go. Let me tell you a little bit about our journey over the past couple of years. We implemented something called the finance operating model. And what that really was to help us move from the local markets doing a lot of the finance work to a shared service model, where we had a group of centers. We selected Costa Rica, Prague, and Malaysia as our 3 locations for our centers. Basically, we moved a lot of the work from the local markets into the shared service centers to take advantage of the labor arbitrage and the cost savings that we had associated with those particular markets. We consciously made some decisions to move the work as is. And so what that meant was that we had manual, inconsistent, geographically dispersed business processes using some tools that were common, some tools that weren't common, some technologies that were enabled, some that weren't necessarily distributed across the entire enterprise. And we basically lifted and shifted all of that into our shared service environment, our global business services group. When we started to look at how we would want to automate, we looked at the fact that we had limited experience and expertise in how we were automating. We were automating specifically at the task level. And then we were doing some small scale pilots and really modeling our processes based on what was happening in a very isolated perspective. We call that our legacy human workforce model. And our aspirations are really to drive towards a smart digital workforce. And what that really means to us is that we're using scalable enterprise capabilities, integrated technologies. We're making some decisions on how we're going to continue to work using action-based decision making versus some of the kind of the human gut instinct that we were using before. We're automating processes instead of tasks. So we're looking from an end-to-end perspective to figure out how do we automate that entire chain of events. We're looking at process modeling across the entire enterprise. something that, again, before we were very isolated in how we were doing that. And then instead of small scale pilots, we're really looking to create some durable long-term value. We believe that if we can move towards a smart digital workforce model, we have the ability to save costs in terms of our outsourced third-party contractor, in terms of licensing, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of even some compliance, contract management, et cetera, around costs. We believe we can reduce our cycle times of our processes. We think that we can even improve the process quality. And then we know we can enhance our service availability to a much more 24/7 approach. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we're organized. I'm in global business services. I'm running the technology organization, but let me talk about the other groups first. Our focus is very much on our processes. So we have a very process-focused lens. We have groups that are responsible for order to cash, for source to settle, which includes procure to pay, source to procure, pay to settle, et cetera, employee and expense management. We also have account to record, FP&A, master data management. So we have a group of folks that are very, very much responsible for global processes across those financial back office activities. We have an operations team, which is responsible for internal controls and for continuous improvement and for kind of the financial health of the GBS organization. And then we have our centers, which are, again, like I discussed, based in Costa Rica, Prague, and Malaysia. The technology team that I'm responsible for is basically the way that we're going to enable all of those other organizations to be successful. So we have several activities under our portfolio. We're selecting various technologies to ensure that we have the right ability for us to standardize. For instance, we have different e-invoicing capabilities and technologies across all of our centers. It's very difficult for us to standardize if our e-invoicing technologies are different between Costa Rica, Prague, and Malaysia because they're using different tools to do the same work. And each of those tools has their own way of doing things. So we're making decisions around how do we bet on the specific big technology plays in order for us to become more efficient, more productive, more stable. We have an analytics COE, which is responsible for ensuring that we have transparency and visibility into a lot of the activities that we're doing, the things that we're doing to operate, things that we're doing to kind of meet our strategic goals and objectives, and even visibility into some of the activities that the local markets, the countries that we work in, and how we interact with them and the types of exchanges and engagements that we have with them. So our analytics COE is responsible for all of that. The other thing that they're responsible for is to help us with our process mining initiatives. So we again take a very focused look at processes, and their responsibilities are to dig in, use Celonis, build the visualizations, build the analyses in order for our global process owners and our center leads and our operations teams to be able to use that information to standardize, harmonize, and then for my team to help automate. And so that's the third leg of my technology organization, where we're automating some of the repetitive, manual, rules-based human processes that we have embedded in the way that we work through our shared service organization. So that's what our organization looks like. Let me talk a little bit about some of the insights that we've been able to glean over the past few months in order for us to become more successful. So process leadership is one of the key components of our approach. I showed you the global process owners on the previous slide. Basically, this group is responsible for re-engineering and simplification, understanding where we have issues, where we have different activities that happen between different markets. Maybe Belgium does something differently than Switzerland. The question would be why? Is there a compliance reason for that? Or is there a way that we can standardize those activities across those markets and ensure that we have the ability to move forward as one organization with one approach to doing the work? They're driving end-to-end alignment across the entire enterprise. So these are folks that are enabled to work globally and to drive things from that perspective. And they have the authority and the decision rights to work with our key stakeholders and make sure that we have the right approach to our processes. We also do what we call agile automation. Now, agile automation has a couple of different meanings. One, it's an iterative approach to how we automate, how we work with our stakeholders, how we look at the various scenarios, and we automate some of the specific things that are happening in our environment. But it's also to ensure that we have the ability to focus our automation path balanced with our requirements for standardization. So what we don't want to do is wait until all of our processes are perfectly standardized in order for us to automate. We believe that if they are standardized, there's much more ability for us to reap the benefits of automation. But we also don't think that we also believe that it's a realistic approach for us to automate a bulk of the process. And that's where we potentially can start to use Celonis to dig in. Some of the challenges that we have are, again, around these process fragmentations. Things are inconsistent. It requires some detailed alignment. The ERP platforms aren't fully standardized. Those are some things that we're really trying to drive. And we need to redesign based on some data-driven approach. SME knowledge is insufficient. We found that we were talking to tens of people. There was one example where we started to do an automation where we talked to about 40 different people in order to understand the specific process itself. And humans, when they talk about their process, they talk about what they know, but they don't know everything. And so it was difficult for us to piece all of that together. And so what we really believe we need to do, if we switch to the next slide, is apply Celonis to this process redesign database decision-making activity in order for us to come up with an analytical mapping of the actual process, a data-driven approach to what that process looks like. That'll help with our fragmentation. It'll help with our global process leadership in order to stabilize and standardize, and it'll also help us with our automation activities. So our value-driven approach to how we want to drive intelligent automation across our enterprise is really a couple of different pillars here. The first one is the business process automation. We talked about that a little bit. It's really how do we take highly leveraged processes that have lots of let's say, third-party outsourced contractors doing the work that's repetitive, rules-based, and ripe for human errors. So can we automate a lot of that? And then can we also use automation and data-based decision-making to help us drive some of the activities that we want to do as an organization going forward? We believe that the consistent methodologies, consistent tools and technologies, consistent ways of working are critical to that. We believe that the enablers of intelligent automation, not just RPA, not just OCR, but things like process mining and process modeling are very important for us in order to kind of drive this approach, this value-driven approach. And then, like I talked about in the previous slide, the enterprise process management is a critical component for us to be able to drive that end-to-end process leadership, redesign processes, re-engineer processes, standardize processes, improve processes across our entire organization. If we switch to the next slide, you can see where Celonis potentially comes in and helps us drive in that technologies and capabilities point of view. So we believe Celonis is an active component of our automation strategy. So let me dig into Celonis a little bit. Christoph, can you give me control? Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yep.
All right, great. So this is not Merck data. I just want to be clear up front. This is data that we've kind of pulled together so that we can do a demo. We have here in our process overview, if you will, basically a purchase to pay analysis. And the way that this process runs is that we create a purchase requisition item, we create a purchase order item, we send that purchase order item to where it needs to go, we receive the goods, we scan the invoice, we book the invoice. And I'm showing you a little bit of a visual for how this works. the one thing that you'll need to notice here is that there's about 1.1 million purchase order items. There's about $2.2 billion worth of net order value in this whole analysis. What I'm looking at right now is one variant out of the 655 variants that exist in this purchase to pay analysis. And that covers about 38% of all cases. So you can see 420,000 cases are covered by this particular analysis out of the 1.12. Well, how do we get to the others? One of the things we can do is we can start to expand our scope and our view into the process itself to try and understand how those particular variants are running. So you can see right here that if we look at this second variation, we're instead of creating the purchase requisition item and then the purchase order item, we're creating the purchase order item to begin with. And then the third one is where we're actually changing the price. And we're taking a look at what is happening here and why are we changing the price after we've already sent the purchase order and before we've received the goods. So one of the things that you can take a look at, again, we've got 3 of our variants covered with about 64% of our cases. But one of the things we can take a look at is the throughput time and the changes that are made but based on these various processes. So you can see that our typical approach to sending a purchase order and receiving goods is 8 days. But when you change the price from a manual perspective, you're adding 9 days onto your process. And so we can really start to dig in and really get an understanding of exactly what's going on in this space. If we take a look at, the top 9 of our processes, you can see that the chart gets to become a little bit complicated. And then if we really take a look at every single process or every single variation, all 655 variants and 100% of our cases covered, you can see that we have a very big mess that we're going to have to dig into and try and understand. Let me kind of bring that back. So that's the Process Explorer. Now, if we take that same Process Explorer and we start to take a look at how does the master data fit into that? So I can start to take a look at vendor or material groups, company codes. I can look at this process with that specific lens. If I take a look at my vendors, you can see that I've got CEB Barcelona is my biggest vendor here. I spend about $1 billion with them. And I can focus and filter directly on exactly what it is I'm doing with that particular vendor. I can look at exactly what types of material group I work with them on. I can continue to use this Process Explorer and start to drive what the specific changes are in the different variants of our processes, et cetera, just specifically with this vendor, CEB Barcelona. I don't have to use that vendor. I can take a look at a specific company code or a specific document type, and I can do that same analysis in this overview as well, just to get an understanding of what are the different types of levers and master data components that are important for me to understand how this process is working. And finally, if I take a look at I'll show you the automation component. What I'm looking at right now is, again, the entire stack of 1.1 million orders, $2.16 billion worth of value. And then I can see how much automation I have associated with each step. So you can see that there's 29% for this create purchase order item. Only 29% of this specifically is automated. If I wanted to take a look at the company codes or the purchasing organizations, that are associated with automation, I can see how we can drill into specific vendors even potentially and understand how automated those specific vendors are. So an interesting one would be this electronics components distribution. There's about 36% of automation with the 2,500 invoices that come in from them. And again, I can start to see that only 13% of their purchase order items are automated. Only 27% of the receipt of goods is automated. And this Process Explorer is very, very specifically focused on the electronic components distribution once I select this. So you can see I can really dig into this. I can use the power of this. I can understand how much of this is already automated. I can make decisions as to what we need to automate based on some of these variations. And so the way that we're using this tool is really to take a look at the top get back here. Basically, this is what's called the happy path and the top variance. And if we can automate somewhere between 60 to 80% of our processes, and we believe that we can use that to drive much more standardization and much more throughput and efficiency for us in an automation perspective. You saw the quote from Bill Gates earlier on that basically said, if you're automating an inefficient process, you're magnifying that inefficiency. Well, we're trying to basically take that 50 to 60 to 70 to 80% of that process and automate it so that the other 20 to 40%, if you will, of that process can be standardized through our global process organization and through our business service center organization. I'm going to give the presentation back to Christoph. All right, and so let me go walk through a little bit of our guiding principles for automation. Our focus has been to build an enterprise framework, but drive the automation specifically for finance up to this point in time. Our governance structure is defined so that it can be leveraged and expanded across the various groups that we're trying to automate for. But again, we're immediately focused on finance with an eye towards ensuring that over time we can move more and more of the enterprise into our automation approach. So how do we prioritize? We're prioritizing by process. We're really taking a look at the specific processes, the specific numbers of people associated with that, the specific value associated with each of those processes in terms of what an automation approach would do for us in that particular process. We're looking at minimizing cascading, and what I mean by that is we don't want to automate a component of the process that's only going to speed up a downstream work hitting a downstream queue that's still manual. So we want to take a look at what are we going to automate and how do we make sure that we're not increasing the amount of time or the amount of work effort by a manual organization from that point of view. We're looking at controls. We absolutely need to keep control over everything that we're doing. So we're looking to figure out how do we eliminate the controls that are manual because we've automated the step, or how do we automate those controls to ensure that we're still managing that appropriately. And then, like I talked about a little bit before, we're balancing the automation and the transformation. So we don't believe that it makes sense for us to standardize 100% in order for us to automate. We believe that if we can get to the 60, somewhere between 60 and 80% standardization or transformation of the process, that we can start to automate that. And then we can use the global process owner group and the business service center groups, the center groups, to standardize into that automation. And then I talked a little bit about automating the happy path and some of those major variants. From a realization perspective, we're looking at measuring and realizing as well by each process. And our value drivers aren't necessarily all cost savings. There is a significant component, FTE reduction, specifically in our third-party outsourced groups, is where we're targeting. But we're also looking at cycle time improvements and process quality. And then we use a term called peak shaving, which is basically how do we reduce the seasonality of our activities, specifically things like the close process or our planning process. How do we use automation to get rid of some of those big surges in activity and people in order to make those things work? From a change management point of view, we're really looking at how do we engage our stakeholders as early as possible in the process, ensuring that we have the ability to ensure that the whole group that would be affected is part of the discussion up front, part of the design of the automation, and part of the building an understanding of how the automations are going to work and how things are going to change for those folks that are involved in that particular process. We're looking at things to make sure that we're accounting for market sensitivities. There's a lot of automation that's happening in the shared service world. And so in some of our locations, some of our markets, we have some specific sensitivities because several folks have potentially moved from companies that have automated their their jobs away. So we're very sensitive to that. And we're trying to make sure that people understand that if you're an employee of Merck, that we're trying to figure out how to drive more of your role into a more value-added opportunity, and to educate them on what it is to work as a human with a bot. And then finally, on the technology guidance side, we're prioritizing security and we're prioritizing control. We have to ensure that we're able to scale so that we can meet the entire demand of our automation roadmap. We want to make sure that we have system governance. If a source system changes, our automation tools can typically handle some of the small changes. But if we have a major change, for instance, if we decide to go from where we're at in SAP to S4, there's going to be some fairly significant changes that we're going to have to make and ensure that we have the ability to handle that within our automation space. We're looking at building reusable components. So how do I build a component that can log in to a generic system versus building a specific component to log into each and every system? So we're looking to figure out how do we reuse a lot of these things. Our intake options is pretty much where we're talking about working with various stakeholders and doing interviews, and in conjunction also use things like Celonis to enable us to drive our data-based decision making, looking at where we have more of an automation opportunity. And then again, we started basic, and we're starting to working through just straight up RPA activities. How do we automate a specific step that has specific rules? And then we're moving into some of the more complex activities today, where we're looking at optical character recognition, reading data off of an invoice or an order, and understanding what that data is, and then using the robots to kind of push that data into the source systems themselves. So that's where we're at for guiding principles for automation. Our future perspective is basically how do we leverage Celonis beyond the automation? I talked a little bit about this. We're definitely using it to standardize our key processes. So our global process owners have access to the specific process models that we've built. And we've mined those processes. We've added our source systems into that. And their goal is to figure out how do we reduce the 655 variations that we saw in the purchase to pay model that I showed you earlier, down to a smaller number, so that it's much more manageable and much more standard, so that our shared service centers are the folks that are executing our activities, the third-party resources that we use. They don't have to understand each and every market variance. We can standardize that into a specific set of work instructions for people to follow. We're looking at potentially using this in what we call our due diligence process. So when we migrate new markets into global business services, can we use Celonis to understand what those processes are ahead of time and understand how many people are involved, so that it's no longer some sort of a guess as to how many people we actually need to run those processes once we move things from the local market. And so that's what we're doing in the due diligence process. And then finally, we're looking at the various market interactions. So the various countries that we work in and we work for. Can we, they need to send us information so that we can execute, and vice versa. So the question is, can we use Celonis to help us understand the quality of some of those interactions between us, the time that it takes between when a market submits something versus when we can actually do something. And we believe that Celonis is extremely important for us to be able to dig into those market interactions and understand them and be able to help standardize and correct them going forward. So finally, our key takeaways, and then I'll turn it over to Christoph. We believe that Celonis is a key to enable intelligent automation. I described how we're basically taking the happy path and some of the major variants, somewhere between 60 to 80% of our global processes, and we're automating that. And then we're using the global process owners and the business service centers to help standardize into that automation. We believe that the guiding principles that I walked through, where we're focused on processes, where we're focused on value realization, where we're focused on the change management activities, and a data-driven approach to understanding how we're going to automate, those are critical for us. And then, again, Celonis is definitely beneficial beyond automation. my focus is automation, but we have a big global process organization and a shared service organization that's really focused on process standardization, normalization, harmonization. And so we believe that we can use Celonis in many, many different ways in order to enable our business. Christoph?
All right. Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, very much appreciate the vision that you bring to combining different technologies to not only think about concepts, but really execute and deliver results. So very inspiring, and very much appreciate the partnership. So let's move over to the Q&A. You can continue posting in the panel. So we add the questions as we go through them. So the first question was just to provide some context. Is you mentioned a lot of Celonis across the finance processes. Can you elaborate a little bit about what processes are you using Celonis for at the moment, and where do you want to move in the future?
Sure. So within finance, we have our procure to pay, and AP and order to cash all live. We have some supply chain activity that we're working with as well. So I'm working with my colleagues over in the supply chain area, and we're trying to drive a lot of the process mining over there as well. But in our future, so we're looking at all of the standard out-of-the-box cookbook activities that Celonis provides, specifically in supply chain and specifically in finance, master data, record to report, other things like that, accounts receivable. But we're also looking at some of these non-standard processes that we have inside our industry and inside our specific company, where we're taking a look at using Celonis, the technology, and helping to build some of our own process models that make sense. So, for instance, we're looking at how do we manage artwork. That's not an out-of-the-box Celonis process model. And so we're looking to figure out how do we build a process model around how we manage our artwork to ensure that we have compliance across the entire globe for all of our products, and make sure that they're labeled appropriately for the indications and other safety warnings that we have on them. So that's where we're going with our process models, is really help flesh out some of the finance ones, working with the supply chain team to also enable and instantiate some process models there, and then to work on some of the non-standard processes that are important to our business, where we're starting to take a look at automation.
Awesome. Perfect. Another question was, you mentioned analytical mapping of processes. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how that works and what you mean with that term?
Sure. So analytical mapping of processes, really it's how do we take our source systems and map them into the process models that exist? So can we build a quick proof of value and drive visibility into a specific process, and take our source systems and map them in? So we have multiple source systems within the Merck environment, a lot of SAP, but not all SAP. But how do I take SAP data and non-SAP data and kind of pull them into a common process model, making sure that I have the right components linked together, so that I can see a full holistic picture of my process itself across all of those source systems. And so that's really where we're trying to drive our analytical process model.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Then you spent some time on the organizational setup. One question here was, where do the Celonis users actually sit? You mentioned process owners, the analytical COE. Who is actually leveraging the technology? So leveraging the technology, we have our process teams, our process ownership teams. So our global process owners and their sub-process team leaders, they're taking a look at those processes on a daily basis. We're also working to start to expand the scope of the use of the tool to the operators and the managers of those operators. So how do we get visibility into the business service centers, the actual folks who are executing the invoice payment process, for instance,
how do they get access and visibility into how the processes are working and the specific variations and so on that are in place. So we're really looking to kind of broaden the use of the Celonis tools across the process owners as well as the operators and execution teams around the processes themselves. And then obviously my automation team is using it as well in order to ensure that we have the ability to understand where our automation opportunities are, what the happy path and the major variants look like, so that we can use that to kind of drive our automation roadmap.
Mm-hmm. Then, I mean, one question, or we have a couple of questions around how to change organizational culture around automation, taking some of the fear and looking at opportunities. How do you see Celonis helping with changing that kind of assessment of what automation can bring to the people in the organization?
Well, I think Celonis itself can help by, honestly, I think transparency into the process is a huge enabler for people to just really get an idea of, oh my gosh, this is something that we really need to change. And so Celonis gives us that view. Again, like I talked about earlier, sometimes for one of our automations that we were trying to drive, we had to interview somewhere between 40 and 50 people in order to get in what I would call probably a 50% view of what the process really looked like. And so using Celonis, it opens up people's eyes, regardless of where they sit, so that they understand all of the inconsistencies and inefficiencies that we have in our process. And I think that what it does is it engages people and it enables them to kind of start to think about how they would change the process to make it better. And so the other aspect that we're trying to drive, it isn't just the Celonis play, but the other aspect that we're trying to drive in that is we're trying to educate folks as to what automation is and what it does and how it works, and specifically even to some of the technologies and capabilities that we use. We're starting to educate some of our Merck employees, or we're planning to educate a lot of our Merck employees as to what those specific technologies are and how they can potentially educate themselves and start to take part in that automation journey.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Then there's another question around the evaluation of Celonis. Like, how did you get started with evaluating the technology? And can you take us a little bit through the journey of evaluation and implementation?
Sure. So Celonis isn't the only tool out there, but we did a fairly thorough evaluation, and we started to take a look at the technologies that were available to us. And then we engaged Celonis to help us initially take a look at what it would be like to apply a process mining approach to our procure-to-pay environment. So we actually worked with Celonis to get visibility to that, to start to understand the types of process variations that we had within our specific processes using our specific data. And then that enabled us to kind of take a look at this capability, these tools, using the Process Explorer, using the automation view. There's a conformance checker to a specific type of process model. So if you have a process model already defined, you can conformance check against that particular process model within the Celonis tool. So all of those features led us to the conclusion that it made the most sense for us to move down the Celonis path when it came to process mining, especially since there was an automation initiative here at Merck. It also enabled us to see how much was automated versus how much was manual, and helped us to drive and make some of those decisions.
Awesome, perfect. So we are almost finished at the 45-minute mark. I'll close down the Q&A now. Before I'll say some of the closing words, I want to use just a brief time to recommend every one of you attending today of our upcoming webinars. We have 2 analyst webinars with Owen and Forrester, where we shed a little bit more light around how Celonis can be used for accelerating digital transformation, and get some light around operation process change in your customer journey with an analyst from Forrester. And our next upcoming customer webinar is with Schlumberger, an oil and gas company here based in the US, where we're taking a look not at process transformation, but system migration, where we take a look at how Schlumberger has used Celonis to accelerate ERP rollouts. So with that, I thank you very much, Steve, for a great presentation, a lot of insights, and really great inspiring vision about what you can do in the combination with Celonis and RPA and automation. So thanks very much, Steve, and thanks for everyone for attending. The recording will be sent out shortly, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at any point. So thanks very much. Have a great week, and see you soon in the next webinar.
Thank you, Christoph.
Thank you.